Hello, I'm here in St Cuthbert's Church, Lawton, to mark the annual feast day of St Cuthbert, which was yesterday, the 20th of March. Now, Cuthbert was born in Northumbria in about the year 635, the same year which Aidan founded the monastery on Lindisfarne. He came from a well-to-do English family, and like most boys of that class, he was placed with foster parents for part of his childhood and taught the art of war. It seemed from stories about his childhood that he was brought up as a Christian. And he used to spend some time as a boy looking after neighbours' sheep. Here he learnt to appreciate solitude and quiet communion with God. And it was on one of these occasions that his life changed. Gazing into the night sky, he saw a light descend to earth and then return, escorting, he believed, a human soul to heaven. The date was August the 31st, 651 AD, the night that Aidan died. Soon after that experience, Cuthbert went to the monastery which Aidan had founded in Melrose and asked to be admitted as a novice. Early in his monastic career, a plague struck Northumbria, driving many Christians back to pagan practices. Cuthbert himself almost died of the disease, and the monks prayed for him throughout his illness, day and night. Even though he never fully recovered his strength, Cuthbert threw himself aggressively into missionary journeys, travelling around Northumbria, aiding stricken people and reviving their Christian faith. He remained in Melrose for 13 years and became the prior there. He would go from house to house, teaching, counselling and healing. And so many miracles occurred in his ministry that he became known in his life as the wonder worker of Britain. At the age of 30, Cuthbert moved to the monastery in Lindisfarne, where he became prior. And for 10 years, he was an active missionary. He developed the gift of spiritual healing and was in much demand as a spiritual guide. He was described as an outgoing, cheerful, compassionate person and became very popular. But when he was 40 years old, he believed that he was being called to be a hermit and to do the hermit's job of fighting the spiritual forces of evil in a life of solitude. So Cuthbert retired in 676, devoting himself to prayer on the tiny island adjoining Lindisfarne known as St Cuthbert's. His successful efforts of protecting birds made him one of the earliest wildlife conservationists. He later moved to the more remote island and larger island of the Inner Farm, and here he built a hermitage where he lived for 10 years. His fame for holiness grew, and people would not leave him alone. They went out there in their little boats to consult with him and ask for healing. However, on many days of the year, the sea around was simply too rough to make the crossing, and Cuthbert was left in peace. At the age of about 50, he was asked by both church and king to leave his hermitage and become a bishop. He reluctantly agreed, and for 2 years he was active, travelling like a bishop like Aidan had been. He journeyed extensively, and on one occasion he visited the Queen in Carlisle. He had a second sight whilst he was with her of her husband the king being killed in a battle in Scotland. Feeling the approach of death, Cuthbert retired back to his hermitage on the inner farm, where, in the company of the Lindisfarne monks, he died on March the 20th, 687 AD. His body was taken back and buried in Lindisfarne. But that's not the end of this story. People who prayed at the grave claimed miracles of healing happening. To the monks of Lindisfarne, this was clear sign that Cuthbert was now a saint in heaven, and they, as the saints' community, should declare this to the world. In those days, people felt it important, when they prayed for help or healing, to be as close as possible to the saints' relics. And so, if a community made relics available, that was equivalent to a declaration of a sainthood. And the monks of Lindisfarne were determined to do this for Cuthbert. They decided to allow 11 years for his body to become a skeleton, and then elevated his remains to the anniversary of his death. It believed that in those years, the beautiful manuscript known as the Lindisfarne Gospels were made, and they were used for the first time at the great ceremony of the elevation. The declaration of Cuthbert's sainthood was to be a day of joy and thanksgiving. It turned out to also be a day of surprises, even shock. For when they opened the coffin, they found no skeleton, but a complete and undecayed body. That was a sign of a very great sainthood indeed. And so the cult of St. Cuthbert began. Pilgrims began to flock to the shrine. The ordinary life of the monastery continued for almost another century until the Vikings came. And the monks were totally unprepared, and some were killed. Some younger ones and the boys were taken and sold as slaves. Their gold and silver was taken, and the monastery partly burnt down. And after that, the monastery lived under threat. And it seemed that in the 9th century, there was a gradual movement of goods and buildings to the near mainland. And the body of St. Cuthbert was carried by the monks and villagers to the old Roman town of Chesterley Street. After the Norman conquest in 1066, the Benedictine community replaced the St. Cuthbert one, and they began to build the great Norman cathedral at Durham. They proposed to honour the body of St. Cuthbert with a new shrine immediately east of the new high altar, and in 1104 the place was ready. At this point, it seems spurred on by doubts expressed by others about the truth of the tradition of the undecayed body. That in Durham, the monks opened up the coffin again and found, as it was said, that the body was indeed still uncorrupted. So throughout the Middle Ages, the coffin was placed in a beautiful shrine and visited by a great number of pilgrims. But at the Reformation, when the monasteries were dissolved, the shrine was dismantled and the coffin opened again. It seemed that the body was still complete. It was then buried in a plain grave behind the high altar. In 1827, the coffin was again opened, but this time they found a skeleton. The objects in the coffin were removed and now can be seen in the cathedral's treasury. The human remains were reburied. And in 1899, the coffin was again opened, for scientists to perform a post-mortem on the remains. The report confirmed that the skeleton was consistent with all that is known of St Cuthbert in his lifetime. The human remains were reinterred in the same place and marked by a plain gravestone with the name Cuthbertson, which is still the site of many pilgrimages today.